Deputy Smith, you're going first?
Yes.
Yeah. So 5 minutes each. Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Las Ceann Corla. Aleppo was once a symbol of the democratic resistance to the Assad dictatorship in Syria. I visited Aleppo in 2011, just before the revolution began and before a very nasty civil war and proxy war, I would argue, by many regimes took place on its soil. And while I was there, I met, in a beautiful city of Aleppo, in the souk, I met communities from the Palestinian areas, and I met members of the gay community across Aleppo, young people who were very brave and very impressive and very happy and very hopeful about the future. Today, Aleppo is buried under rubble and in a pool of blood, and Assad's troops are going house to house, butchering anyone who's left alive. And the only reason that Assad could succeed in this butchery and torture and absolutely abominable war was because he had the help of Russian military intervention. And we live in a world where the great powers increase conflict to divide that world between them for their own influence and for monetary and economic greed. Saudi Arabia and Qatar funded various jihadist groups throughout Syria to increase their influence, and the US of A tried to find moderate opposition groups so that it too could gain leverage in the region and over that country. Russia is in an alliance with Iran and sought to shore up their own influence and turned this conflict into a dreadful sectarian war, a brutal war that has been fuelled by various imperial powers. And I believe that Aleppo is a warning to the world today that barbarism will come when imperialist powers try to carve up the world between them, and this may indeed happen again. And Western powers do not have clean hands. Across Europe, arms have been traded into Syria in a very serious way. Calls for Western intervention do nothing to lessen the harm, do nothing to lessen the horror. And we know this because we have the recent legacy of Iraq, and indeed cities like Fallujah would remind you of what's happening in Aleppo today. So Western intervention is not the solution. But I do want to point in the European Union to the amount of arms that are exported from Europe to the Middle East. 1.2 billion of an arms trade remains open from the Middle East, or directly from Europe into the Middle East. And it is amazing to see the statistics and the graphs on this. The biggest recipient of those arms is Saudi Arabia, which is totally engaged in the conflict in Syria, receiving about 829 million worth of arms in the last 2 years. And the sort of weaponry they use is absolutely horrific, between weapons that can kill by shooting, bomb, tanks and planes that can drop horrible explosives on communities. So the question for us is, how do we respond to this? Because we can sit here and cry, and I sometimes feel like crying when I think of those young people, but that won't achieve anything. And I want to argue that how we should respond in Europe is by first arguing that if the European Union does anything, it should shut down the arms trade. That 1.2 billion arms trade to the Middle East should end immediately, and on top of that, instead of investing 5 billion into a fund for more arms, more weaponry, more hardware in an EU defence fund, we should put that money into opening the borders and bringing people into Europe who are stuck on the Turkish border, 2.3 million of them in camps on the Turkish border, through a dreadful deal that the European Union did with Turkey. We should tear up that deal immediately and open the borders, not just for the people who are sitting in Turkey in camps coming into the winter and the cold and the desperation, but for the tens of thousands who are now fleeing Aleppo and the surrounding areas. If we do anything at all, we have to think about how we deal with refugees, and instead of turning the Mediterranean into a graveyard and giving a historic blow to human rights, we need to reverse that process. Turkey has broken international law by sending refugees back into Syria. There's evidence of that, and that deal should be torn up immediately. I want to finish by saying, If we don't do this, we are saying Happy Christmas Syria, Happy Christmas Aleppo in the most cruel and unconcerning way. We are in breach of human rights, I would argue, in the European Union if we don't open our borders. And I just wonder where those young men and women are now. Are they at the bottom of the Mediterranean? Are they locked up in some torture chamber? Are they in the grave? Or are they under a pile of rubble? And millions like them are being neglected by us in Europe while we remain the wealthiest part of the planet. Shame on Europe. We have a lot to answer for.
Deputy Smith, thank you. Deputy Paul.